When we talk about countries most likely to survive a global conflict like a hypothetical World War III, geography becomes one of the most underrated yet decisive advantages. Some nations are essentially built like natural fortresses, protected not by modern weaponry or alliances, but by the physical world itself. These countries gain a survival edge simply because reaching them, invading them, or sustaining military operations against them becomes incredibly difficult and resource-draining. And in a large-scale conflict, where every major power is stretched thin, that difficulty often translates directly into strategic safety. One of the first elements that gives certain countries an inherent advantage is pure isolation. Nations surrounded by vast oceans enjoy a built-in shield that makes them extremely hard to reach without overwhelming naval capabilities. Oceans act as buffers, slowing down any form of aggression and adding layers of logistical complexity. Moving troops, equipment, or supply chains across thousands of kilometers of water isn't just expensive, it's risky, unpredictable, and incredibly vulnerable to disruption. Countries positioned far from major conflict zones naturally fall lower on the list of strategic targets because attacking them demands enormous commitment with unclear payoff. In a chaotic global war environment, aggressors prioritize targets that are easier, closer, and more directly tied to the main theater of conflict, leaving isolated nations with a better chance of staying intact. But it's not only isolation that matters, terrain itself can be a silent defender. Mountainous countries, for example, have historically been some of the most difficult places on Earth to invade. Steep ridges, narrow valleys, unpredictable weather, and limited mobility make large-scale troop movements almost impossible to sustain. Even modern military struggle in such environments because their greatest advantages, speed, heavy vehicles, air support, are restricted by rugged landscapes. These regions favor defenders who know the terrain, who can move quickly through difficult areas, and who can fortify natural choke points. For a country with such geography, even a powerful opponent faces the constant threat of attrition, supply shortages, and terrain-driven setbacks. That alone significantly increases the nation's chances of surviving an extended global conflict. Then there are nations with harsh climates that deter prolonged military operations. Extreme cold, blistering heat, dense jungles, or vast deserts all serve a similar function: they punish unprepared armies. Tanks freeze. Aircraft performance drops. Supply lines break. And troops face fatigue that no amount of training can fully overcome. A country with an unforgiving environment doesn't even need the most advanced military to remain resilient, the land itself becomes a barrier. In a high-stress global conflict, attackers avoid environments that promise long-term losses with little reward. This again shifts the strategic pressure away from such nations and buys them valuable time and distance from the worst stages of a global conflict. Geopolitical positioning also plays a quiet but powerful role. Some countries don't sit near global flashpoints. They're not located next to rival superpowers, contested borders, or resource-rich regions that tend to attract foreign interest. Because of this, they are less likely to become battlegrounds. Even if a global war erupts elsewhere, these geographically quiet nations face lower odds of being dragged in directly, allowing them space to focus on internal stability and defense rather than constant frontline exposure. Their location alone gives them the breathing room necessary to avoid becoming immediate targets. When you combine isolation, harsh climates, rugged terrain, and distance from major power rivalries, certain nations simply become far too costly or strategically irrelevant to attack. They're like the high ground in a battlefield, difficult to reach, even harder to hold, and rarely worth the losses. And in a world where conflict spreads quickly, those natural advantages aren't just helpful, they're often the deciding factor in survival. When you look at which countries have the best chance of surviving a global war, the conversation can't stop at geography alone. Survival isn't just about being hard to reach, it's also about being able to stand on your own feet when the rest of the world is collapsing. In a large-scale conflict, the first things to break are the global supply chains we all take for granted. Food imports slow down, fuel becomes scarce, trade routes are disrupted, and international markets turn chaotic. Countries that depend heavily on the outside world suddenly find themselves vulnerable not because they're being attacked, but because they can't sustain themselves without global stability. That's why nations with strong, self-sufficient economies and abundant natural resources hold a massive advantage. They don't just survive the hits, they can endure the prolonged disruptions that would cripple others. Food security is one of the biggest factors here. Countries with fertile land, advanced farming systems, and the ability to produce more than enough food for their own populations become significantly harder to destabilize. When other nations are scrambling to secure grain shipments or worrying about supply shortages, a food-secure country can continue feeding its people even under wartime pressure. This isn't just about agriculture, but about resilience. A stable, well-fed population remains calmer, more unified, and more capable of supporting the national effort. Meanwhile, countries that rely heavily on food imports immediately face a ticking clock the moment trade is disrupted. That difference alone creates a major divide between who can withstand long-term conflict and who cannot. Energy independence is another huge pillar of survival. Modern militaries, industries, and even basic daily life rely on massive amounts of energy. Whether it's oil, gas, hydropower, or renewables, countries that can power themselves without foreign assistance gain an enormous edge. In a world where fuel shipments might never arrive and international energy markets may collapse overnight, nations with strong internal energy production can keep their factories running, maintain transportation networks, and support their armed forces without relying on external help. That ability to generate steady power in unstable times becomes a quiet superpower that keeps the nation functioning while others slide into blackout-induced paralysis. Industrial capacity is just as important. Countries that manufacture their own equipment, vehicles, technology, and essential goods won't crumble under supply chain breakdowns. They can rebuild what gets damaged, produce replacements for lost machinery, and adapt quickly to shifting wartime needs. Even simple things like maintaining medical supplies, producing construction materials, or keeping communication systems operational become monumental challenges for nations without a strong domestic industrial base. But for countries that already make these things at scale, the transition from peacetime production to wartime mobilization is far smoother. Their factories are already diversified and capable, their workers experienced, and their infrastructure built to handle large outputs. Economic resilience also plays a quiet but crucial role. Some nations have diverse, flexible economies that don't rely too heavily on any single export or global market. These countries can absorb global shocks more effectively because their financial systems, industries, and labor forces can pivot without collapsing. When international trade contracts and global demand plummets, they don't fall off a cliff, they stabilize, adjust, and keep moving. It's not glamorous, but economic stability during chaos is one of the most powerful predictors of national survival. All of these elements together form a kind of internal shield that's just as important as any military defense system. A country that can feed itself, fuel itself, manufacture what it needs, and maintain a stable economy becomes incredibly hard to break. Even if the outside world is falling apart, these nations retain the ability to operate independently, make decisions calmly, and recover faster. In a global conflict where unpredictability becomes the norm, self-sufficiency isn't just an advantage, it's the foundation of survival. Another powerful factor that often determines whether a country weathers a global conflict is its political positioning. Not every nation is tangled in the rivalries, alliances, and power blocks that tend to ignite worldwide confrontations. Some countries have spent decades, sometimes centuries, crafting a diplomatic identity built on neutrality, balance, or deliberate non-alignment. And in a crisis as large as a hypothetical World War III, that strategic distance can become one of the greatest survival tools any nation can possess. Neutrality isn't just a label, it's a long-term strategy. Countries that consistently avoid taking sides in major global disputes often earn a reputation for staying out of other nations' quarrels. This creates a kind of political buffer. Other states, even powerful ones, tend to view them as low-priority targets because they offer no direct threat and provide no strategic victory worth the cost of conflict. And when the world starts to fracture into opposing camps, these neutral players can slip between the cracks, remaining unaligned while everyone else is forced to pick a side. That ability to avoid immediate entanglement gives them space, time to secure their borders, stabilize their society, and prepare for whatever uncertainties lie ahead. But neutrality alone isn't always what keeps a country safe. Sometimes, it's the art of balanced diplomacy, the ability to maintain good or at least stable relations with multiple major powers simultaneously. Countries that avoid antagonizing any single faction, that spread their diplomatic ties across rival blocs, become much harder to classify as the enemy of anyone. They're positioned in a kind of political middle ground where attacking them would anger multiple sides at once, essentially making them too inconvenient to target. In a global war where escalation risks spiral quickly, very few nations want to open up additional fronts just to go after a state that hasn't taken a hostile stance against them. There are also nations that have built their identity on non-alignment, deliberately staying outside military alliances and power blocs. These states don't rely on superpower protection, nor do they contribute to the entangling obligations that might drag them into a war they never wanted. In times of peace, this independence can seem modest or symbolic. But in wartime, it becomes a shield. It gives them the flexibility to navigate diplomatic chaos without being automatically assigned a role in the conflict. They can negotiate, mediate, or simply step back, focusing inward while the rest of the world engages in destructive competition. Perhaps even more importantly, politically neutral or non-aligned nations often position themselves as humanitarian corridors or safe diplomatic grounds. They become hubs for negotiations, peace talks, or refugee movements. This gives them international relevance without making them military targets. Their value lies in being stable and untouched by direct conflict, which encourages warring powers to preserve their neutrality rather than violate it. That role, being a place where global tensions can cool rather than escalate, offers an additional layer of security, one built not on military strength but on diplomatic usefulness. Another thing worth considering is that non-aligned or neutral countries often develop strong internal strategies to reduce dependence on any single foreign partner. They diversify trade, maintain balanced economic ties, and build relationships with multiple regions. This reduces the risk of being pressured or coerced when tensions rise. They don't collapse when one major power starts cutting off resources or shutting borders, because they've deliberately spread their connections wide. This practical independence mirrors their political independence, giving them yet another advantage in surviving a global crisis. When war breaks out on a worldwide scale, any nation that manages to avoid becoming a target automatically jumps ahead in the survival race. Political neutrality and non-alignment don't guarantee safety, but they dramatically lower the chances of becoming a battleground. These countries stay out of crosshairs not through military dominance or geographic isolation, but through carefully cultivated diplomacy. In a world fractured by conflict, being seen as harmless, helpful, or simply not worth attacking becomes one of the most powerful shields a nation can possess. In any discussion about which countries stand the best chance of surviving a global conflict, there's a point where the conversation naturally shifts from geography and diplomacy to pure preparedness. Because even if a nation is isolated, resource-rich, or politically neutral, none of that matters if it can't defend itself when push comes to shove. Survival in a high-intensity, worldwide conflict depends heavily on whether a country has built the kinds of systems that can withstand sudden strikes, prolonged pressure, and unpredictable threats. And what often separates the survivors from the vulnerable is how much they've invested in advanced defensive capabilities long before the world ever reaches a breaking point. Modern defense isn't just about having a large army or powerful weapons. Those things matter, but the real advantage lies in how well a nation can detect, prevent, and absorb damage. Countries with sophisticated early warning systems, radar networks, space-based monitoring, advanced communication channels, can react faster to threats, mobilize their forces earlier, and make smarter decisions under pressure. When you have accurate information before anyone else, you're already ahead of the danger. It's like seeing a storm on the horizon while others are still looking at blue skies. That time difference, even if it's just minutes, can save entire cities. Air defense networks play a similar role. Nations that have invested in layered defensive shields, systems that can intercept aircraft, drones, or incoming missiles, create a protective bubble around their population and infrastructure. These networks don't make a country invincible, but they significantly reduce the impact of the first wave of any attack. And in global conflicts, surviving the first wave is often the key to surviving the entire war. If a nation can keep its command centers, communication lines, and essential facilities intact in those opening moments, it maintains the ability to make strategic decisions instead of scrambling in chaos. Another underrated strength is the resilience of military infrastructure. Some countries have learned from past conflicts and built hardened bunkers, underground command posts, and protected storage sites that can withstand enormous stress. These facilities act as the backbone of stability when everything above the surface becomes uncertain. Even if major cities or bases take damage, the protected infrastructure allows the country to regroup, respond, and continue functioning. In contrast, countries without these protective measures often lose their ability to coordinate or defend themselves early in a large-scale conflict, which rapidly accelerates their collapse. Cyber defense is also a critical part of modern survival. In a world where digital systems control everything from power grids to banking to transportation, a crippling cyber attack can be just as dangerous as a physical strike. Nations that invest in secure networks, strong encryption, and rapid response cyber teams have a better chance of keeping their society functioning when others face widespread outages or economic panic. Cyber resilience doesn't look dramatic, but it prevents the kind of internal meltdown that can topple a country from the inside during a global crisis. Then there's the civilian side of preparedness. Some countries maintain robust civil defense programs, public shelters, emergency supply systems, nationwide alert networks, and well-practiced evacuation strategies. These efforts might seem old-fashioned or unnecessary in peacetime, but during a global conflict, they become one of the most valuable survival assets. A well-prepared population isn't just safer, it's calmer, more organized, and far more capable of supporting the nation's defensive efforts. Countries that integrate their citizens into preparedness planning gain a level of societal resilience that pure military strength can't replicate. When all of these elements come together, early warning systems, air defense layers, hardened infrastructure, cyber protection, and civilian readiness, a country becomes significantly harder to break. It doesn't have to win every battle, it just has to stay standing long enough to outlast the worst of the chaos. And in a world where global war would push every nation to its limits, those with strong defensive foundations have the best chance of emerging on the other side still intact.